5 years. That's how long Ethan Cole has lived under the same roof with his wife without ever touching her. Not a kiss, not a glance that lingered. Just silence. Polished and expensive, like everything else in his mansion. From the outside, he's the perfect man. The billionaire CEO of Cole Group, a master of control, power, and precision. But behind those glass walls, his marriage is a frozen contract, a business alliance wrapped in gold. And tonight, for the first time in half a decade, something is about to break that silence. As the sun rises over Beverly Hills, Isabella Cole stands by the window, still wearing the same wedding ring that feels heavier every year. 5 years ago, she said "I do" to save her father's company. She remembers the cameras, the applause, the flawless smile Ethan gave to the crowd. It wasn't love, it was a signature, a deal disguised as a promise. But this morning, everything feels different. The air is heavier. The footsteps she hears behind her, his footsteps, don't sound like the usual echo of distance. When Ethan finally speaks, his voice isn't cold. It's calm, deliberate, and unfamiliar. He says only one thing: "Be ready by 7. You're coming with me tonight." No explanation, no reason. Just a command wrapped in curiosity. And as the day unfolds, Isabella can't help but wonder, why now? Why, after 5 years of silence, does the man who never looked at her suddenly want her by his side? She doesn't know that tonight, under the golden lights of Los Angeles, the world will finally see them together, and the man who never felt anything will begin to feel everything. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our heart-touching stories about love, redemption, and second chances. And now, sit back, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Because what happens next will remind you that even the coldest hearts can still learn how to love again. There are homes so beautiful that even silence looks expensive inside them. The Cole Mansion on the hills of Beverly Hills was one of those places. Every morning, the house awakened not to laughter or voices, but to the sterile rhythm of success. A butler polished silver trays, a maid arranged roses imported from Italy. And in the middle of that quiet perfection stood Isabella Reed Cole, the wife of one of Los Angeles' most powerful men. She often wondered what love was supposed to feel like, because after 5 years of marriage, she still didn't know. 5 years ago, the world had watched her wedding as if it were a royal event. She remembered the flash of cameras, the applause, the delicate lace of her gown that shimmered like liquid sunlight. Everything had been choreographed, every smile, every vow. Everyone saw a fairy tale. No one saw the contract. Behind the golden vows was a deal. Ethan Cole, CEO of Cole Group, had saved the Reed family empire from bankruptcy. In return, her father offered him a merger, a partnership sealed not only in ink, but in matrimony. For Ethan, it was another strategic victory. For Isabella, it was the price of her family's survival. The media called it the power couple of the decade. But inside those marble walls, there was only distance, measured not in miles, but in heartbeats that never met. Every morning, Isabella followed the same ritual. She'd open the curtains to let the California sunlight in, not because she enjoyed it, but because it reminded her that somewhere out there, people were living real lives. She'd sip her coffee alone at a dining table built for 12. Sometimes she imagined what it would be like if Ethan joined her. If they could talk like normal people, not business partners trapped in silence. But that fantasy never came true. He always left before breakfast, his footsteps fading down the hallway, like the echo of another promise unkept. He was everywhere in the city, on magazine covers, on business news, on billboards that showed his perfect face, but nowhere in her life. The tabloids called him the man who never loses. To Isabella, he was the man who never even tried. Then came that morning. The light was the same, golden and slow, but something felt heavier, as if the air itself was waiting. When Isabella came down the grand staircase, she stopped. Ethan was sitting at the table, 5 years of breakfast, and she had never once seen him there. He was reading something on his phone, his sleeves rolled, his posture composed. Every inch the billionaire who could command the world with a glance. Except this time, he looked up, and for a heartbeat their eyes met. It wasn't long, but it was enough to make her heart stumble. He set the phone down, reached for his coffee, and said casually, "There's a gala tonight. Be ready by 7. You're coming with me." That was it. No explanation. No reason. Just a statement, cold and precise. Isabella blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. It wasn't, "Would you like to come?" It was, "You're coming." Command, not invitation. Still, something in his tone felt different. She nodded faintly, hiding her confusion behind a polite smile. "Of course." When he rose to leave, she caught the faintest trace of his cologne, an old scent she hadn't noticed in years. And for reasons she couldn't explain, it made her pulse quicken. The rest of the day unfolded like a dream she wasn't sure she wanted to wake from. Her stylist arrived with gowns. Her assistant brought jewelry boxes she hadn't opened in months. Isabella stared at herself in the mirror as soft curls fell around her shoulders. 5 years had changed her face. There was still beauty, yes, but also something else. A kind of quiet strength born from years of pretending she didn't care. She slipped into a crimson dress that traced the curve of her spine. Her mother's old pearl necklace rested at her throat, a relic of gentler times. And as she looked at herself, she whispered words she hadn't said in years. "You were born to be loved, not displayed." But tonight, she wasn't sure which one she would be. When Ethan knocked on her door precisely at 7, Isabella felt a jolt of nerves she couldn't hide. He stood there in a perfectly tailored black suit, his tie dark as midnight, his expression unreadable. For the first time in years, he looked human, not distant, not cruel, just real. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. Neither spoke as they walked through the long marble corridor, their footsteps echoing like a conversation they hadn't had yet. Inside the limousine, silence settled between them again. He scrolled through his phone. She watched the reflection of city lights sliding across the tinted glass. Their faces met briefly in the reflection. A man and a woman bound by law, divided by emotion. Reflections that never touched. Then unexpectedly, his voice broke the stillness. "Stay close to me tonight. People will want to meet you." She turned, surprised, but before she could respond, he looked away. The tension between them was sharp enough to draw blood. The gala was everything the city worshipped. Luxury, ambition, and golden light. The chandeliers dripped with crystal. The air smelled of champagne and secrets. When Ethan entered the hall with Isabella on his arm, every head turned. For years, the press had speculated whether he was even married. Now they were seeing her, his wife, the ghost behind the empire. Isabella felt the flash of cameras sting her skin, the heat of whispers ripple through the crowd. She wished she could disappear, but then she heard his voice, calm, confident. "This is my wife, Isabella Reed Cole." And then, a miracle, he smiled. Not the polite, photo-ready smile the world knew. A real one, subtle, genuine, and it stopped her breath. For a single moment, 5 years of walls cracked, and through that fracture, something alive flickered again. The evening moved in waves of noise and laughter. Isabella kept her posture perfect, the way she'd been trained to, but her thoughts drifted, restless. What was this new version of him? Why now? And then came Adam Turner, the investor with the warm smile and easy charm. He greeted her like an old friend, not a trophy wife. "Finally," he said, "I get to meet the most mysterious woman in Los Angeles." She laughed, surprised by her own voice. "Mysterious? I think you mean invisible." He laughed louder. Ethan, standing nearby, did not. As the night went on, Adam kept her engaged with stories, jokes, genuine curiosity. And for the first time in 5 years, Isabella felt seen, really seen. But across the table, Ethan grew quieter. His eyes followed her, calculating, cautious. Every smile she gave Adam pulled another thread loose inside him. He didn't understand the feeling. Jealousy had never belonged in his world. Yet here it was, raw, alive, and entirely out of his control. When Adam left the table to take a call, the air between husband and wife turned electric. Ethan leaned closer, voice low. You seem to be enjoying yourself. Isabella looked up, steady. Maybe because someone actually talked to me. He drew a slow breath and looked away. The rest of the dinner passed in uneasy silence. But as the night ended, when Adam returned to say goodbye, Ethan stood first. I doubt that, he said coolly. My wife has a full schedule. It wasn't just protective, it was possessive. The ride home was quiet again, but not empty this time. Something had changed between them, something fragile, like glass warming in the sun. When the car stopped in front of the mansion, Isabella turned to speak, but Ethan was already watching her. His eyes, usually cold as steel, held confusion now, and something softer. You surprised a lot of people tonight, he said. Including you? Including me. Then he stepped out, leaving her in the car with a storm she couldn't name. That night, as she stood before her mirror, she touched her reflection like it was someone new. Her pulse still carried the echoes of the evening, the flashes, the music, the way he had looked at her for the first time. 5 years of emptiness and suddenly a spark. She didn't know if it was hope or danger. And somewhere down the hall, in another silent room, Ethan stared out at the city lights and realized, for the first time in 5 years, he could no longer pretend he didn't see her. Something shifted after that gala. No one in the city could see it, but inside the Cole mansion, silence no longer sounded the same. For 5 long years, the house had been nothing more than glass, marble, and protocol. Now something invisible had begun to move through its hallways, a rhythm, faint and uncertain, a heartbeat that didn't belong to the machines of wealth, but to something fragile and human. It started the morning after. When Isabella Reed Cole came down the grand staircase, she expected the same emptiness as always. But there he was again, Ethan Cole, her husband, the man who treated her like furniture for half a decade, sitting at the table. The sight of him at breakfast was so rare she froze mid-step. The newspaper trembled slightly in his hands. The smell of freshly brewed coffee floated in the air. Except this time, the cup on the other side of the table wasn't empty. There was a second cup, steam rising, 2 sugars, 1 drop of milk, exactly how she liked it. For a moment, she thought the maid had made a mistake, but the look Ethan gave her wasn't distant, it was expectant. It's for you, he said simply. Not cold, not polite, just quiet. She sat slowly, watching him over the rim of the cup. He didn't look away. The man who once measured life in profit margins now looked at her as if he were searching for something he'd lost years ago. 5 years ago, she might have given him a thank you. Now she didn't know what to say, so she took a sip. The coffee was perfect. Too perfect. And that frightened her more than if it had been wrong. In the days that followed, it continued. Wherever Isabella went, Ethan was there, subtly, silently, as if studying the art of presence. He appeared in the living room while she read, in the kitchen while she poured water, at the balcony when she watched the sunset. Sometimes when she looked up suddenly, she'd catch him standing by the doorframe, pretending to check an email, but his eyes told another story. At first, she thought it was coincidence. By the 3rd day, she knew it wasn't. One morning, she asked dryly, "Do you live here now?" He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that cracked the ice but didn't melt it yet. "Just passing by." She raised a brow. "Ethan, this corridor leads nowhere." He cleared his throat, looking suddenly human, almost boyish. "Then maybe I got lost." She didn't say anything, but later when he left, she realized her heart was still racing. A few nights later, the phone rang. The screen lit up. Adam Turner. Her pulse stumbled. She hadn't heard from him since the gala. Adam, the man who, in one night, had managed to do what Ethan hadn't in years, make her laugh. Before she could decide whether to answer, Ethan appeared at the doorway. He didn't knock. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on the phone in her hand. "Who is it?" he asked. His voice was calm, but the muscles in his jaw betrayed him. "It's Adam," she said carefully. "From the event." A pause, a flicker in his eyes. "And are you going to answer?" She frowned. "I haven't decided yet." "Maybe you shouldn't." "Why?" "Because I said so." That was the moment something inside her snapped. She stood, her voice trembling with fury that had been aging quietly for 5 years. You don't get to tell me what to do, Ethan. You haven't spoken to me in half a decade, and now you suddenly act like you care? He stared at her, breathing unevenly, as if every word was cutting open something buried deep. Then softly he said, "Because I do care." "You care?" She almost laughed. "About what? Your reputation?" "No," he said, voice breaking. "About you. I'm afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of losing you." The words hung there, fragile as glass. For a second, the world seemed to stop. In those 4 words, the untouchable billionaire sounded like a child who had just realized he'd broken something he couldn't fix. That night, Isabella couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing those words echo over and over. "Afraid of losing you." It would have been easier if he'd shouted, if he'd blamed her, dismissed her, turned back into the cold man she knew how to hate. But fear, real human fear, was something she didn't know how to fight. The next morning brought another surprise. Ethan was in the kitchen. Again. But this time, he wasn't sitting. He was cooking. Smoke filled the air like fog over a battlefield. A pan hissed in agony. Something black and unrecognizable sizzled in butter. Isabella blinked. "Is that supposed to be food?" Ethan looked down, embarrassed. "It was supposed to be an omelet." She tried not to smile. "It looks more like regret." He laughed quietly, the sound rusty from disuse. "Maybe, but I wanted to do something nice." "Nice," she repeated. "For me?" He shrugged, eyes flicking toward her nervously. "Who else?" It was the first real laugh they'd shared since their wedding. Even the smoke alarm seemed to join in. From that day on, Ethan kept trying, awkwardly, desperately. He started small, simple gestures that no billionaire assistant could outsource. A single flower cut from the garden, a door held open, a question asked not because he needed information, but because he wanted to hear her voice. And slowly, very slowly, Isabella began to see him. Not the CEO, not the strategist, the man underneath all that armor, flawed, clumsy, lost. She found herself laughing again at things she didn't expect, at him tripping over his own words, at his look of triumph when he managed to fry eggs without setting off the alarm. It was ridiculous and strangely endearing. One afternoon, he came to her study holding a single white rose. He offered it without words. She looked at him, suspicious and curious all at once. "You cut it yourself?" He nodded. "From the garden." "You realize the gardener's going to be furious." "He'll survive." She took the rose, its scent filling the room like a memory. "Thank you," she whispered. It wasn't much, but for Ethan, it was everything. But healing isn't a straight line. For every small step forward, there was a step back. Adam's name appeared on her phone again one evening. A simple message. "Hope you're doing well. Coffee sometime." Before she could even think, Ethan saw it. The light in his eyes changed. Dark, sharp, uncertain. "It's him again," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied, equally calm. "Are you going to meet him?" "I don't know." "You mean yes?" "I mean, I don't know, Ethan. I have the right to answer if I want to." He clenched his fists, trying to control the storm rising behind his voice. "I'm not trying to control you." "Then what are you doing?" He hesitated, his throat tightened. "Trying to protect you." "From what? A polite man who wants coffee?" Something in her tone made him snap. He turned, his voice rising for the first time. "You don't get it, do you? You don't see what he sees in you." "And what do you see, Ethan?" Silence. He couldn't answer. She looked at him, tears burning behind her eyes. "You know what's worse than hating someone? Being invisible to them. And that's what I've been to you for 5 years. A ghost walking around your empire." He stepped forward, his voice trembling. "I see you now." Too late. She walked away, but her heart was pounding, her chest tight with something she didn't want to name. Later that night, she found him sitting alone in his study. The lights were low. The city glowed outside the glass walls. He looked smaller somehow, like the skyscraper he'd built his life on had begun to crumble. When she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "My father used to say love is a weakness," he said softly. that feelings make men fail. She didn't turn back. And you believed him? I did. For too long. He took a shaky breath. But when I saw you laughing with that man, it felt like watching the only good thing I ever had slip away. And for the first time, I didn't care about power. I just cared about you. The honesty in his voice cut deeper than any anger. She could have ignored rage, but vulnerability, real, raw, was harder to face. Without a word, she left the room. Not because she didn't feel something, but because she did. The next morning, the house felt different again, lighter, quieter in a softer way. She found him waiting by the door with 2 cups of coffee. "Good morning," he said. It was simple, but the way he said it, gentle, uncertain, sounded like an apology for everything he'd never said before. She took the cup, their fingers brushing for a moment, and something small, something dangerous, shifted between them. That afternoon, he appeared at her study door again, holding a small box. Inside was a key. "What's this?" she asked. "The key to my office," he said. "I thought, maybe you'd want to see the world I live in." It was more than a gesture. It was an invitation to his life, his space, his trust. And for the first time, Isabella saw not the man who had trapped her, but the man who was trying, awkwardly, painfully, to set her free. That night, they ate dinner together for the first time in years. The table, once a symbol of distance, became a bridge. Candles flickered. The smell of burnt pasta lingered in the air, a reminder that perfection was finally giving way to humanity. They spoke about nothing and everything, books, music, memories. And when the laughter came, it was soft, hesitant, like a language they were relearning. At one point, she looked at him and smiled. "You're acting strange, Ethan." He grinned, awkward but sincere. "Good strange or bad strange? The kind that makes me suspicious. Then I'm doing something right." They both laughed. That night, as Isabella lay in bed, she realized the house no longer felt like a prison. It felt like something unfamiliar, something alive. And though she didn't know where this fragile truce would lead, she couldn't deny it anymore. For the first time in 5 years, Ethan Cole was no longer the stranger she had married. He was becoming the man he was always meant to be. And deep down, in the quiet of her heart, she wondered if she was ready to meet him halfway. Every love story has a moment when the light changes, when what once felt real suddenly looks like an illusion. For Isabella Reed Cole, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon. The air inside Cole Group's headquarters was still, heavy with the quiet hum of ambition. She hadn't meant to find it. She wasn't looking for secrets, only an old document her assistant had misplaced. But fate has a cruel sense of timing, the kind that waits until you start believing in someone before showing you who they really are. It was nearly sunset when she opened the glass door to Ethan's private office. Everything about the room screamed precision: dark mahogany shelves, gold-plated pens, files stacked like soldiers. She'd been here countless times before, but always as a visitor in someone else's world. Now curiosity, or perhaps intuition, pushed her toward the cabinet behind his desk. The bottom drawer stuck slightly, as if it didn't want to open. When she finally pulled it free, a leather-bound folder slid out. Reed Cole Merger Agreement. The name hit her like a whisper from a past she'd tried to forget. Her fingers trembled as she turned the pages. And then, there it was, a clause written in perfect corporate language. The marital union between Ethan Cole and Isabella Reed shall serve as the consolidation of assets between both parties. Should the couple fail to produce an heir within 5 years, the contract may be dissolved and all merger terms nullified. The room seemed to tilt, her vision blurred. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. 5 years, that number again. The same 5 years she had just begun to believe meant something else. The coffee he made, the roses he cut, the dinners, the laughter, the gentleness. Had it all been a countdown? Was every act of kindness not love, but a strategy? Her mind replayed every moment like broken film. The first breakfast together, the soft apologies, the way he'd said, "I'm afraid of losing you." Now those words twisted into something darker. Afraid of losing her? or afraid of losing his company? The papers slipped from her hand, scattering across the polished floor. The noise startled her, but she didn't move to pick them up. She just stood there, staring at the fragments of her marriage, printed in black ink. Tears welled up, blurring the edges of the room. The life she'd started to rebuild, the fragile warmth she'd allowed back into her heart, shattered again. For 5 years, she had lived as a stranger in his house, but nothing hurt more than realizing she might have been useful, not loved. That evening, when Ethan came home, the house felt colder than usual. The lights were dim. The staff had retreated to their quarters, sensing something was wrong. On the dining table lay the folder, open, waiting. Ethan walked in, unbuttoning his jacket, only to freeze when he saw it. The look on Isabella's face told him everything before she even spoke. Her voice was low but sharp enough to cut through the silence. "You might want to sit down." He didn't. She gestured toward the papers. "I found it." He swallowed hard, eyes flicking to the contract, then back to her. "Found what?" "The truth." Her tone didn't rise, it didn't need to. Rage that quiet is more dangerous than screaming. "So tell me, Ethan," she continued, her voice trembling, "how long have you known? Did you have it marked on your calendar? The exact date our marriage would expire?" He looked stunned. "Isabella, I don't." She stepped closer, holding up one of the pages. 5 years, Ethan. 5 years to give you an heir, or the deal falls apart. And suddenly, after 5 years of nothing, you decide to smile, to care, to remember I exist. Convenient timing, don't you think? He reached for her, but she stepped back. "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" she demanded. "Because it looks a lot like I was part of a corporate plan." "I didn't write that clause," he said quickly. "My father did. I didn't even know it was there." "Don't lie to me," she snapped. "Your signature is right here." He glanced at the document, his own handwriting staring back at him like an accusation. "I signed hundreds of pages that day," he said. "I thought it was just legal formality." "Formality?" Her laugh was hollow. "You call turning a woman into a business asset a formality?" He closed his eyes, pain flickering across his face. "I never wanted it to be like this." "Then what did you want, Ethan? A wife or a womb?" The question hung in the air like thunder. For the first time in his life, Ethan Cole, man of power, of control, of certainty, had no answer. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Isabella's eyes glistened, her voice breaking despite her strength. "Do you have any idea what that did to me? To wake up every morning wondering if I was worth anything beyond your company's stock value?" Ethan stepped closer, desperation softening his tone. "I swear to you, Isabella, I didn't know. Everything I've done lately, it wasn't about business. It was about you." "You expect me to believe that?" "Yes," he said simply, "because it's the truth. But truth, once broken, is hard to rebuild." She shook her head, backing away. "You can't buy my trust back, Ethan. Not this time." When she turned to leave, he reached out instinctively but stopped himself. For once he understood that holding her back would only push her further away. So he stood there, watching her walk away, the sound of her heels fading like the heartbeat of everything he'd just lost. Outside, the night was sharp with wind. Isabella stepped into the car, her vision blurring as city lights streaked past the window. Her reflection looked foreign, a woman older than her years, her heart heavy with the weight of false beginnings. For 5 years, she had learned to live without love. Now she had to learn to live without illusion. Back inside the mansion, Ethan stood alone in the room that once represented control. Now it felt like a courtroom, and he was the only one on trial. He sat down, the folder still open before him. The words on the page glared up at him like ghosts. "Shall serve as consolidation of assets." His father's voice echoed in his mind, cold, proud, certain. "Love is weakness. Marriage is leverage." Ethan buried his face in his hands. He had spent his entire life believing that sentiment made men soft, that feelings were flaws to be managed, not honored. And now the very thing he feared, vulnerability, was the only thing that could save him. But it was too late. Down the hall, the bedroom stood dark. The bed they had once shared, barely touched, looked emptier than ever. A faint trace of her perfume lingered in the air, ghostly and sad. He walked in, stood by the window she used to open every morning, and whispered to no one, "I didn't mean to lose you." The city outside glimmered, indifferent. He turned away, his reflection in the glass fractured by the lights. Half man, half regret. The great Ethan Cole, the man who owned empires, couldn't even hold on to his own heart. That night, the staff noticed something strange. The lights in the study stayed on until dawn. Inside, Ethan was still sitting there, unmoved, staring at the contract that had stolen 5 years of their lives. By sunrise, he hadn't turned a single page, because sometimes the worst punishment isn't what you lose. It's realizing you never knew what you had until it was gone. Somewhere across the city, in a quiet hotel room, Isabella sat by the window, watching the morning bloom. She held the wedding ring in her hand, the same ring that once symbolized hope, now just a circle of cold metal. She placed it on the table beside her coffee cup and whispered, almost to herself, "Maybe I was never his wife, just his contract." But even as she said it, a tear fell, because deep down, part of her still wished it wasn't true. In Beverly Hills, the Cole mansion stood still again, silent and flawless as ever. Yet something had changed forever. The empire remained intact. The world kept spinning. The headlines still called Ethan Cole a visionary. But inside, the man was crumbling, his success echoing hollow against the emptiness he'd built around it. Love had never been part of the deal, and now he finally understood the cost. Because the only thing more expensive than power is the price of a heart you realize too late you were supposed to protect. When Ethan Cole opened his eyes that morning, the city outside his penthouse still glittered like it always did. But it no longer belonged to him. The silence was thick, the bed was cold, and the space where Isabella used to sleep, where her scent once lingered faintly of jasmine and coffee, was empty. She was gone. The woman he had ignored, misunderstood, and finally loved too late, had walked out the door and taken the last piece of his soul with her. For years, Ethan had ruled the skyline of Los Angeles. Every building, every merger, every headline, his name stood at the top. He had built Cole Group into an empire of numbers and control. He knew how to calculate risk, how to manipulate a market, how to win every battle, except the one inside his own heart. And now even the numbers didn't make sense anymore. He canceled board meetings, ignored investors' calls. The screens in his office flashed red, markets plunging, contracts collapsing, but he barely noticed. For the first time in his life, the man who always controlled everything had lost the one thing that made it worth controlling. Days bled into nights without meaning. Sleep refused to come. He would sit for hours by the window, the city below flickering like broken stars. Sometimes he imagined her there, Isabella, smiling faintly, her eyes soft but disappointed, and the guilt would twist deeper until even breathing hurt. When his father, Gregory Cole, arrived unannounced one evening, the sound of the door clicking shut echoed through the mansion like judgment. Gregory's presence filled the room instantly, the same power that once built generations of success. His voice was sharp, cutting through the dim light. "Do you realize what you've done?" Ethan didn't answer. He just stared at the dark reflection of himself in the window. "You've humiliated this family," Gregory continued. "The Cole name used to mean strength, discipline, and you've thrown it all away for a woman." The words hit like knives, but Ethan didn't flinch. He'd heard versions of this lecture his whole life. This time he simply turned and said quietly, "No, Father, I didn't lose it because of her. I lost it because of who I became without her." Gregory's jaw tightened. "Love doesn't build empires, Ethan. It destroys them." Ethan stepped closer, his voice low, steady. "Then maybe our empire deserved to fall." For a long moment, father and son just stared at each other. Two men shaped by the same name, but no longer the same kind of man. When Gregory finally turned to leave, the sound of the door closing felt like the end of a legacy. The next morning, the headlines were already calling Cole Group's decline the fall of a giant. Stock prices dropped. Rumors spread like wildfire. And yet Ethan didn't care. He had already made his decision. He spent the entire night drafting a statement, then tore it apart a dozen times. Words felt empty. How could he apologize to the world for what he had done when he hadn't even forgiven himself? But at dawn, when the city began to wake, he finally knew what he had to do. He called a press conference. By noon, the ballroom of the Grand Hyatt was full. Reporters, cameras, investors. The hum of whispers filled the air, a sea of expectation and curiosity. Everyone wondered what the once invincible Ethan Cole would say. When he walked onto the stage, the noise died instantly. He looked thinner, paler, older. There were dark shadows beneath his eyes, but his posture was steady. He wore no mask this time, no arrogance, no armor. Just a man stripped of everything except the truth. He stood behind the podium, stared at the cameras, and began. 5 years ago, I built an empire on control. I believed success was everything, that money could buy peace, that contracts could replace trust. He paused, his voice trembling for the first time. And somewhere along the way, I forgot how to be human. A murmur rippled through the crowd. He continued anyway, his tone growing softer, rawer. I turned love into business. I turned a woman into a transaction, and I called it marriage. The words hung in the air like thunder. Even the journalists stopped writing. Her name is Isabella Reed, and she didn't just save my company 5 years ago. She saved me. I just didn't see it then. The silence deepened. Today, I resign as CEO of Cole Group. I no longer deserve to lead people if I don't even know how to love them. He took a breath, eyes glistening. There are things in life more valuable than profit, more powerful than legacy, and the greatest of them is love. Then he stepped back from the microphone and removed his watch, the one his father had given him when he first became CEO, and placed it on the podium. For the first time in my life, he said softly, I'm done measuring time by success. And with that, Ethan Cole walked off the stage. Across the city in a quiet hotel room, Isabella Reed sat motionless, watching the press conference unfold on TV. The world called it the fall of Cole Group, but as she listened, she saw something different. The man on that stage wasn't the cold executive who once calculated every word. He was bare, vulnerable, real. Every sentence came from somewhere she'd never seen before. His heart. When he said, I'm sorry, it wasn't for the cameras. It was for her. Her eyes stung. The tears came uninvited, falling silently down her cheeks. For so long, she had prayed for Ethan to feel something, to stop living like a machine. And now he finally had. But the irony burned. He had found his humanity only after losing her. That night, the Cole mansion stood still under the silver glow of the moon. Ethan returned home alone. He didn't turn on the lights. The walls, once proud and gleaming, now looked hollow. He walked through the hallways, each step echoing like a memory of what used to be. On the dining table sat the wedding photo they'd taken years ago, the one they had both avoided looking at. He picked it up, ran his thumb across her face, and whispered, I'm sorry, Isabella. The glass frame trembled in his hands. He didn't cry, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. He sat down, the city lights shimmering outside like distant stars. And for the first time in years, Ethan Cole felt small. Not the CEO, not the heir. Just a man who finally understood what it meant to be broken. Somewhere in that same city, Isabella was still awake. She turned off the TV but couldn't turn off her thoughts. She had seen sincerity in his eyes, pain that couldn't be faked. And despite herself, a small voice inside whispered, maybe he truly changed, but pain is slow to forgive, and trust even slower to rebuild. She leaned against the window, looking out at the same skyline that connected them both. Though miles apart, a single tear slid down her face. He finally learned how to love, she whispered. I just don't know if I can learn how to forget. By morning, newspapers across the country carried his face on the front page. Ethan Cole resigns, the billionaire who chose love over power. The world called it a scandal, but for him it was salvation. For the first time in his life, Ethan Cole had lost everything. His title, his company, his pride. And in doing so, he had finally found the one thing he'd been missing all along: his soul. The city of Los Angeles was waking up again, but for Isabella Reed, time had stopped. Days had passed since the world saw Ethan Cole step down from his empire, confessing to the cameras that he had turned love into a business deal. His words had shaken the city, but to her, they had shaken something far deeper. She told herself not to care, told herself it was too late, but the heart doesn't obey the mind, especially not when it once belonged to the same man. And that morning, when she opened her eyes in the quiet hotel room, something felt different. Her body was heavy, her chest tight. The taste of coffee, her usual companion, made her nauseous. She brushed it off at first, jet lag, maybe stress. But as hours passed, the unease grew. Then came the realization: small, sudden, impossible to ignore. In the sterile light of the bathroom, the test lay on the counter. 2 lines, clear, unmistakable. Her breath hitched. The world blurred. She clutched the edge of the sink as tears welled up. She had spent 5 years in a marriage without touch, without warmth, and just when love had finally bloomed, it had shattered under the weight of secrets. And now, this. A heartbeat, still unseen, was growing inside her. Ethan's child. Her knees weakened. She sank to the floor, her palm resting over her stomach as tears spilled freely. "God," she whispered, voice trembling, "I'm carrying his child." 1,000 memories flooded back. The way he'd looked at her during the gala, the quiet mornings with coffee, the press conference where he had bared his soul. He had said he was ready to begin again, and here she was, holding the beginning inside her. She turned on the television almost by instinct. The same news channels were still replaying Ethan's resignation speech, his face pale but determined. "I spent 5 years afraid to love," his voice said through the screen, calm but breaking. "Now I'm ready to start over." Isabella's tears came harder. She pressed a trembling hand against her belly, as if the life within her could somehow hear. "I guess," she whispered softly, "we'll start over with him." That night, the city outside glimmered as usual. Cars, lights, people moving in rhythm with the chaos of life. But Isabella felt something she hadn't in years. Purpose. Not the cold duty of a corporate wife, but something real, pure, alive. She didn't know how he would react. Ethan, the man who once calculated every decision. Would he see this as another responsibility, another deal to fix? Or would he see it for what it was? Grace, in its purest form. She didn't have the answer, but her heart whispered one truth louder than fear. He deserved to know. The next morning, she packed her things. The hotel room, once a refuge, now felt too small. Outside, the world was painted in gold by the California sunrise. Her driver looked at her through the mirror when she gave the destination. Cole Mansion. He didn't ask questions. The drive felt endless. Every turn brought back fragments of a life she had tried to leave behind. The first night she slept in that house, the scent of cedar in the halls, the cold echo of his footsteps, and then the silence of years that had nearly broken her. But today she was no longer that woman. She wasn't returning as the wife who'd been traded for convenience. She was returning as the mother of his child. The gates of the Cole Mansion opened slowly, like a breath drawn after too long underwater. Inside, the house looked the same, but felt different, quieter, sadder. Even the air seemed heavy with remorse. Ethan was there, sitting on the couch in the living room. His head was bowed, a half-finished cup of coffee cooling beside him. The man who once ruled boardrooms now looked like someone who'd lost his entire world. And maybe he had. When he heard her footsteps, he froze, then looked up. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time stopped. He stood slowly, disbelief shadowing his face. The porcelain cup slipped from his hand and shattered against the floor, but neither of them moved. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Ethan." He didn't answer. His throat worked, but no sound came. Only the unspoken question in his eyes. Was she really there? She stepped closer, and for the first time in months, the distance between them began to close. I have something to tell you, she said softly. He nodded, afraid to breathe, as if one wrong move would make her disappear. Her hand moved gently to her stomach. I'm pregnant. The words filled the room like music and thunder all at once. For a moment, Ethan didn't understand. Then it hit him, and his knees almost gave out. He sank to the floor, his hands covering his face. The man who had faced stock crashes and corporate betrayal without flinching, now trembled before a truth that stripped him bare. He looked up at her, tears finally breaking through the wall he had built for so long. She stood there, fragile yet strong, her hands still resting protectively on her stomach. He whispered almost reverently, "Our child." She nodded, her eyes filling too. And in that moment, the world seemed to breathe again. Ethan moved closer, cautiously, like a man approaching a miracle he didn't deserve. He reached out, hesitating until she gave the slightest nod. Then his hand covered hers on her stomach. It was the smallest contact, and yet it felt like redemption. Every mistake, every wound, every silence of the past 5 years seemed to dissolve in that touch. For the first time, they weren't CEO and contract bride. They weren't two broken people holding grudges. They were simply parents. And somewhere deep within that fragile new life, the universe whispered forgiveness. He didn't speak. Words weren't enough. He just wrapped his arms around her and held her tight, his face buried in her shoulders, shaking. Years of pride melted away into sobs he couldn't control. It wasn't the polished, powerful Ethan Cole the world knew. It was the real one, the one who had finally stopped running from his own heart. She held him too, her tears falling silently into his shirt. Neither said the words, "I forgive you," because they didn't have to. The embrace said it all. The cold mansion that had been silent for years finally came alive again, with breath, with tears, with warmth. Later, when they sat together on the couch, the city lights glowed faintly through the tall windows. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't make promises about the future. They just existed in that quiet moment, two souls learning how to begin again. Ethan looked at her, his hands still intertwined with hers, and whispered under his breath, not to her, but to the life growing between them. You saved us before you were even born. Outside, the world still called it the fall of Cole Group, but inside that house, something new had begun to rise, something no empire could buy and no loss could destroy. Love reborn, a heartbeat, once silent, now leading them home. The mansion that once felt like a museum of silence had begun to breathe again. Soft laughter now echoed through its marble halls. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with sunlight. And for the first time in years, Ethan Cole woke each morning not to the sound of business alerts, but to the warmth of Isabella Reed's voice. It had been months since the night she came back, trembling and radiant, carrying their child and the promise of a new beginning. Everything had changed since then, but one evening, as rain whispered softly against the glass, Ethan realized that although Isabella had forgiven him, he had not yet forgiven himself. He found her in the study, reading one of her old novels, the same one she used to hold during those lonely years, back when he barely noticed her presence. Her hand rested on her rounded belly, the faint rhythm of new life beating under her palm. The sight was beautiful, humbling, almost unbearable in its simplicity. He walked closer, words pressing against his chest like confession. For years he had been taught that power defined worth, that love was weakness, that a man must never kneel. But as he looked at her, he understood that pride had been the real cage. He knelt before her, not as a CEO, not as a Cole, but as a man stripped bare of every mask. His voice trembled, carrying both shame and truth. He admitted everything, how fear had ruled him, how his father's cold lessons had poisoned his heart, how he had built a fortress of success only to trap himself inside. And then slowly he opened his hand. There lay a ring, small, simple, yet gleaming with something far more precious than diamonds: redemption. 5 years ago, he said, I married you because of a contract. Today, I'm asking you to marry me because of love. Isabella's eyes filled instantly. The tears weren't from pain this time, but from the quiet shock of being truly seen. Her smile trembled through the tears as she nodded. 5 years ago, she whispered, I said yes because I had no choice. This time I say yes because I believe in you. The rain outside grew stronger, drumming against the windows like applause from the heavens. And just like that, the marriage that had begun as a transaction was reborn as a vow of the heart. The weeks that followed felt almost unreal. Peace had found its way back into their lives. Not grand, not dramatic, but gentle and steady, like a morning tide. Isabella, now 5 months pregnant, glowed in a way that no luxury or spotlight ever could. She filled the mansion with color, flowers on every table, music in every room, laughter in every silence. Ethan, who once held board meetings with military precision, now struggled to tie baby crib bolts and burn pancakes in the kitchen. The great Ethan Cole, once known as the sharpest businessman in Los Angeles, had become a man who fretted over calcium levels and midnight cravings. Every morning he insisted on making breakfast for her himself. It didn't matter that the omelets were uneven or that he spilled orange juice on the counter. To Isabella, they tasted better than anything she'd ever had, because this time it was made with love. Sometimes she would catch him standing quietly at the doorway, watching her read or hum softly to the baby. And when she looked up, he would smile, small, shy, as though still in awe that she was really there. They no longer spoke of Cole Group. The empire was gone, but in its ashes, something new was growing. Together, they started a new venture, Reed and Cole Consulting, a company dedicated not to greed, but to guidance. They helped small businesses rebuild ethically, mentoring young entrepreneurs who wanted to create without destroying. It was Isabella's idea, and Ethan followed her lead without hesitation. When reporters asked him later why he'd left the billion-dollar world behind, his answer was simple: because success means nothing if it costs you your soul. Under her influence, he had rediscovered what ambition was supposed to feel like. Not ruthless, but purposeful. And this time, they built something that truly belonged to both of them. But healing rarely comes without reconciliation. And one afternoon, the past knocked on their door in the form of an old man carrying a heavy silence. Gregory Cole, Ethan's father, arrived unannounced. Time had humbled him. His shoulders weren't as broad, his voice not as sharp. He stood on the porch for a long moment, uncertain whether he was welcome. When Ethan opened the door, the two men simply stared at each other. Years of unspoken words filled the space between them. Regret, resentment, love, pride, all tangled together. Gregory's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. I was wrong, he said quietly. I thought I was protecting you. I thought strength meant never bending, never feeling. But watching you lose everything made me realize I taught you how to build empires, not how to live. Ethan said nothing, only listened as his father's voice cracked. I'm proud of you, Gregory continued, not for what you built, but for who you became. And in that moment, the wall that had divided father and son for decades finally fell. Ethan stepped forward and embraced him. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic. It was quiet, raw, and healing. Because sometimes forgiveness doesn't come in thunder. It comes in silence, in the shaking of hands that have caused each other pain. From that day forward, Gregory visited often. He brought fruits for Isabella, fussed about her diet, and smiled every time Ethan stumbled through his fatherly attempts. The man who once valued control had finally learned to cherish chaos, the good kind, the kind made of family. As spring came, the garden of the Cole estate bloomed brighter than it ever had. It was there, beneath the golden light of evening, that Ethan and Isabella decided to renew their vows. There were no reporters this time, no flashing cameras, no contracts, no investors waiting for their smiles. Only friends, a few loved ones, and the sound of wind weaving through the roses. Isabella walked across the garden path barefoot, her dress simple, her belly round beneath the silk. Ethan waited beneath the old oak tree, the same place where he had once signed countless business deals. Now it would hold the most sacred deal of his life, a promise made not with ink, but with the soul. When she reached him, they didn't speak at first. The world around them seemed to pause. The scent of jasmine, the hum of cicadas, the soft rustle of leaves. It was the kind of silence that holds more meaning than words ever could. Then Ethan took her hands, his eyes glimmering with tears. He promised not to be perfect, not to never make mistakes, but to never let pride speak louder than love again. I vow, he said, that I will never let ambition or fear blind me from what truly matters. And if I ever forget, remind me. Isabella smiled through her tears, her voice soft as sunlight. I promise, she replied, to remind you and to love you even when you forget yourself. They exchanged the new rings, symbols not of wealth, but of second chances. As the guests clapped and the soft music rose, Ethan leaned forward and kissed her forehead, whispering something only she could hear. This time, forever begins with you. As the evening deepened, laughter mingled with music. The once cold mansion glowed with candlelight and joy. Friends toasted to love, to forgiveness, to beginnings that come long after endings. Even Gregory, sitting quietly under the oak, smiled to himself, a smile full of pride and peace. At one point, Ethan caught Isabella watching him across the table. He mouthed the words, "Thank you." She answered simply, "You earned it." When the last guest had gone and the stars filled the sky, they walked together through the quiet garden, hand in hand. The air was cool, the world hushed. Somewhere inside the house, a lullaby played softly. One Ethan had been practicing on the piano, just for their baby. Isabella stopped and turned toward him. The moonlight made her glow. "Do you ever think," she said gently, "that we had to lose everything just to find this?" Ethan smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Maybe that's how love works," he said. "It breaks you first, so you know what it means to be whole." She leaned into him, and they stood there. Two souls who had been strangers, partners, enemies, and now finally home. The night carried their quiet laughter into the stars, and as the wind moved through the garden, the promise they had made that evening seemed to echo back through the years, whispering into every dark corner they'd once lived in. Love is the only empire worth keeping. A year had passed since Ethan and Isabella renewed their vows under the blooming roses of their garden. The world had changed quietly, the way seasons shift when you're too busy living to notice. The house that once echoed with emptiness now pulsed with life. Soft laughter in the mornings, the sound of a piano in the evenings, and the tender chaos of two people learning how to build something real from the wreckage of their past. But nothing could have prepared them for the day when their lives would change forever. The day their son was born. It happened on a summer morning in Los Angeles, when the city was still half asleep, and the sky outside their bedroom window shimmered in pale gold. Isabella woke with a sudden pain that took her breath away, her hand instinctively gripping Ethan's arm. For a split second, he thought she was just having one of those late pregnancy discomforts. Then he saw her face, and panic hit him like a storm. The man who once commanded boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar deals now couldn't even find his car keys. He ran in circles, shouting orders at the nurses and tripping over the hospital bag he had packed a week too early. By the time they reached the hospital, his nerves were unraveling. Machines beeped. Nurses moved fast. Isabella, despite the pain, still managed to laugh at his terrified expression. And then, after hours that felt like years, the world stopped. A cry filled the room. Sharp, pure, alive. It was the sound of life itself, their son's first breath. Ethan froze. His hands trembled as the nurse placed the tiny baby into Isabella's arms. He had faced mergers, crises, betrayals, but nothing had ever made him this weak. The child was impossibly small, wrapped in white, his skin soft and warm against the light. When Ethan finally found the courage to touch his son's cheek, he felt something he had never felt before: absolute awe. Tears blurred his vision. His voice broke when he whispered, "He's perfect, just like his mother." For a long time, the only sound in that room was the heartbeat of a family finally whole. They named him Liam Henry Cole. Liam, after the Irish word for protector, because Ethan had sworn that this time he would never let anything harm what he loved. And Henry, for strength, for legacy, but also for softness, something he learned to carry only because of Isabella. The first months of Liam's life were a blur of sleepless nights, laughter, and gentle chaos. Ethan, who had once signed off billion-dollar reports without breaking a sweat, now fumbled with bottles and diapers as though they were explosives. Every cry from the baby sent him into a frenzy. Every sneeze was an emergency. When Liam laughed for the first time, Ethan nearly cried again. And Isabella, oh, she was radiant. Motherhood suited her like sunlight on glass. She moved through the house with grace and warmth, her laughter melting every shadow that had once haunted these walls. The mansion, once sterile and cold, now smelled of pancakes in the morning and baby powder in the afternoon. The echo of loneliness had been replaced by the babbling of a child learning to form words. Ba, ba, ma. Every time Liam reached out his tiny hand, Ethan dropped everything, no matter what he was doing. The man who had once measured time in deals now measured it in giggles, lullabies, and sleepy smiles. Even Gregory Cole, once the embodiment of pride and restraint, had changed. He became a frequent visitor to the mansion, not as the stern patriarch, but as a grandfather utterly smitten by his grandson. It was a strange sight at first. Gregory Cole, the same man who once scolded his son for showing emotion, now crawling on the floor making faces at a baby, who responded with shrieks of joy. There were moments when he would look at Ethan, his eyes glistening with quiet guilt, and though neither of them said the words aloud, both knew forgiveness had already taken root. Ethan watched his father cradle Liam with trembling hands, and for the first time in his life, he understood him, not as an opponent, but as a man who had once been afraid to lose love too. Even Janet, their loyal housekeeper, and Daniel, Ethan's former assistant, became part of their daily rhythm. They were no longer staff or colleagues, they were family. Every weekend, the house filled with chatter, laughter, and the kind of comfort that doesn't come from wealth, but from belonging. And so, time moved forward, softly, like a lullaby. When Liam turned 1, the garden bloomed again. The same garden where Ethan and Isabella had once renewed their vows now stood decorated with ribbons and white roses. Friends and family gathered beneath the golden Los Angeles sun, their laughter mingling with the rustle of the breeze. There were balloons tied to the trees, a table filled with cakes, and a tiny crown that Liam refused to keep on his head. He toddled across the grass, his chubby hands outstretched, his laughter infectious. Ethan stood by the fountain, watching him, his heart swelling with pride so deep it hurt. Isabella joined him, her dress fluttering gently in the breeze, her hand slipping into his. They didn't need words, but when music began to play, Ethan turned toward her with a smile. Without saying a thing, he took her hand and led her to the center of the garden. The guests fell silent as they began to dance, not with practiced elegance, but with the slow, easy rhythm of two people who had already danced through storms and found their calm. The afternoon sun painted them in gold. Liam's laughter echoed somewhere behind them, and the world seemed to pause for a heartbeat. Ethan looked into her eyes, his voice low and rough with emotion. "I used to think love was a weakness," she smiled softly. "And now?" He drew her closer, his hand resting gently over the place where her heart beat. "Now I know. It's the only thing that gives life meaning." She rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm beneath. For years, that heart had been locked away behind walls of pride and fear. Now it beat freely, warm and human. "Finally," she whispered, "we've become what we should have been all along." Ethan's lips brushed her hair, his whisper carried on the wind. A family. As the sun began to set, the camera would have lingered on them. 3 figures standing in the soft light. The father who had learned to love, the mother who had never stopped believing, and the child who had made them whole. Liam clapped his tiny hands, giggling as a butterfly landed near his cake. Ethan and Isabella laughed too, the sound mingling with the gentle hum of the evening. The sky burned orange and pink, and for a moment it felt as if the whole world was smiling with them, because this was it, the ending every story of pain deserves. Quiet, real, earned. That night, after the guests had gone and the house had grown still again, Ethan stood at the nursery door, watching Isabella rock Liam to sleep. Her voice was soft, humming a lullaby that wrapped around the room like a prayer. He leaned against the frame, his heart full. He had spent so many years chasing the illusion of success, and yet here it was, in the curve of her smile, in the tiny hand curled around her finger, in the peace that came not from victory, but from surrender. When she looked up, their eyes met, and she smiled. He walked in, kissed her forehead, and whispered the words that had been waiting all along. "You were my greatest risk and my greatest reward." She laughed softly. "And you were my biggest mistake until you became my home." They stood together in silence, watching their son sleep. The city lights glowed faintly through the window, but inside the room it was warm, golden, alive. Ethan wrapped an arm around her and whispered one last promise. Not the kind written in contracts or spoken for the cameras, but the kind that lives quietly between two beating hearts. "No matter what happens next, this is what I'll protect." And as the camera fades, the final image remains. Ethan, Isabella, and little Liam, together, laughing beneath the open sky of Los Angeles. The wind rustles through the garden as if carrying a message, a moral written not in words, but in the way they hold each other, gently, honestly, completely. Because in the end, true wealth isn't found in accounts or skyscrapers. It's found in the courage to love again, to forgive, and to begin. True worth has nothing to do with wealth, only with the courage to love again.